Well, welcome to this webinar presented by the IET's Anglian Coastal Local Network, which represents members in both Norfolk and Suffolk. Welcome also to folks from other parts of the UK and indeed globally. I'm delighted to welcome you all. I'm Kevin Foster, and I'm chairman of the Anglian Coastal IET Local Network, and I'll be your host for this evening. We will leave questions until the end of the presentation. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Barbara Roberts. During her career in IT, Barbara has seen a lot of change, both good and bad. She helped to create the first of the Agile approaches in 1994, based on UK industry best practice, and since then has coached organisations through Agile transformations and business change in all sectors of the industry. Her focus is helping complex corporate organizations adapt to a 21st century world. Creation of Agile project management was her original idea, and since its launch in 2010, it has over 100,000 successful exam candidates. Barbara is a regular speaker at conferences and events across the globe, most recently running masterclasses in Australia, Singapore, and Kuala Lumpur. Barbara is known for her pragmatic, common sense, and not too serious approach. So today, Barbara will talk about how Agile came about, how it fits into the modern world, and where it adds value, and where it doesn't. She will also debunk some of the hype and myths around Agile. So Barbara, over to you.
So thank you, welcome everybody, and thanks for joining. What I wanted to talk about tonight is Agile. Is it just a buzzword? Or is it key to surviving or thriving in the 21st century world? We hear an awful lot about Agile at the moment. It's one of the most commonly used terms, which is quite interesting, having been struggling to get it recognised for so many years. So why me? Well, I've been involved with Agile since the very beginning. So as Kevin said, I helped create the first of the Agile approaches. And I've always been passionate about sort of Agile in the corporate world. So if you're a couple of friends setting up a website in from your garage to sell DVDs, it's very, very different to doing Agile in manufacturing or finance or insurance industry. So what I try and do is sort of give people the knowledge and a common sense understanding of what Agile is, and also equally importantly, what it isn't. So what I wanted to talk about tonight is, first of all, Agile, how do we get here? And then cover some of the Agile very basic concepts, and then cover off some of the Agile misconceptions, because there are quite a lot of misconceptions out there. So basically, we started out in the 1960s, and this was very much the rule of the machines. So in these days, software engineers were seen as the magicians and very much the masters of the universe rather than the servants. It was a fun time because this was all pretty new. So we didn't have necessarily formal processes. It was just that you were given the freedom to get the work done. And it was literally just get it done, find a way and get it done. And certainly it was a good area to work in, and it was great fun, particularly if you worked in IT. But there was a basic mistake coming out of this era, which is that when people first defined software engineering, they assumed that it worked in exactly the same way as other styles of engineering. So software engineering was compared to engineering building. And this worked in the early years when the world was sort of just dealing with things, but it doesn't work when you start to involve humans, because humans are interesting, difficult, incredibly creative. They don't all follow the rules, and you can get twins. Even twins will behave slightly differently. So the concept that software engineering is predictable and doesn't change, and it will just follow standard process, was flawed right from the start. When we got to the 1970s, basically, we then had the introduction of processes. So the most famous process, you often hear this talked about, the waterfall process, which was defined by Royce in 1970. And this was specifically to manage development of large software systems. It's quite a long paper, And page 1 showed this very, very simplistic diagram. And you can see why it's called a waterfall, because the expectation is you complete one step before moving on to the next, complete that step, move on to the next. And the expectation was that having completed a step, you wouldn't go back. So this was page 1 of the Royce paper, and this is still current thinking. People still remember this, read this, and think this is the way to do it. Unfortunately, as is true of a lot of things, it was designed for a different world. And this was a world that was very static, where change was the exception and was seen as a problem to be avoided. So you get comments like people keep changing their minds, as if that's their fault and something that shouldn't happen. So interestingly, 50 years later, there's still a lot of this basic waterfall mindset out in corporate businesses, which is not helpful in the 21st century world. What's also interesting is that this is misinterpreted, because if you read on to page 2 of Royce's paper, he states the implementation as described above is risky and invites failure. And page 2 goes on to explore this into a much more complex model with feedback loops going forwards and backwards. Interestingly, hardly anybody seems to have read page 2 of Royce's paper, which was rather unfortunate. So one of the problems with waterfall thinking is, I love this diagram, it's been around for many years, and it's got more and more complex, but it describes what often happens with waterfall thinking, which is the customer has something in mind. So if you speak to somebody of my generation and you say, if you ask me to describe a swing, I describe 2 pieces of rope, a tree and a plank. Unfortunately, in the second picture, my description isn't quite right. So to quote Morecambe and Wise, I've got all the right notes, but not necessarily in the right order. But fortunately, I was explaining what I wanted to a very good analyst who's managed to rework my requirements into something that works, but also built in some extras. So why have a plank when you can have an armchair? It then goes, the requirements then go into a black hole in this traditional style of thinking, and nobody shows anything until it's ready for user acceptance testing. And certainly in my experience, user acceptance testing is often a period of high stress and depression, because the users, the business people, have been waiting this solution for ages, and when it's finally delivered, it doesn't do in any way, shape or form what they were hoping for. So usually in user acceptance test, there's quite a lot of hacking goes on to create something that works. So as you can see from the 5th diagram, we've now got the right pieces, but we've had to hack it around to make it work. And looking at that swing, it would only work if you were lying on it and weren't particularly heavy. Anybody that's worked in support of IT solutions will recognize the bottom left, because I will admit to it, as a developer, we love cutting code. We're not very keen on documentation. And so quite often we just didn't bother. If you worked in help desks, you might know that there was a thing going to be delivered, but you didn't know any more than that. And certainly also in some circumstances, some organizations, the customers billed for a theme park, even though what they actually got was a swing. What the business actually really needed potentially could have been a tire on a rope. And if you move it forward to 21st century thinking, more often these days you see like a net with 4 ropes in it, and it doesn't break children's teeth. But if you ask the wrong person, they will define what they understood, what they think of by a swing. So I'm more likely to describe the ropes and the seat. If you ask somebody much, much younger, they describe a swing differently. So it's trying to help people define good requirements rather than talk about what the solution should be. So once we get onto the 1980s, late 80s, early 90s, the world started to change. And it was an absolutely brilliant time to be working in IT, because the arrival of personal computers changed everything, particularly for people like me. So instead of having to write machine code and punch cards and things like that, you had a computer on your desk and you could do things for yourself. And that gave people like me the ability to sit down with a customer, with a business person, and actually create solutions quickly and easily. And this early style of approach was called rapid application development, where I worked with somebody and I asked them what they want and I built it, and it was fun, satisfying for the customer, great fun for me. And we often focused on the interesting parts and skimped the boring bits. So we didn't do the documentation. We didn't test as much as we should have done, but we handed over solutions very quickly, and it seemed a great way forward. But unfortunately, after 5 or 10 years of this, we recognized that this rapid application development approach was flawed. And people started to talk about rad cowboys, the fact that we'd lost the control and quality, the focus, simply because it says rapid application development, the first word is rapid, so people think it's fast. You ended up with lots and lots of end users solutions, multiple copies of corporate data, and an awful lot of unscalable and unsupportable solutions. But it was great fun, to be fair. So by the time we got to the mid-90s, we started to get very concerned that bad RAD was going to get thrown out. And people would then sort of swing back and go back towards a waterfall approach. And we realized that that's actually equally dangerous. So we recognize that if you're working in a corporate world, we'd gone from sort of quality and user control, control and quality, and we'd gone to rapid and user driven. And actually we recognize that in a corporate world, you've got to have all 4 parameters. So yes, you need to be rapid within reason. Yes, you need to drive solutions by the business, the users, and what they need. But we still also need the control and the quality to make sure that what we create is sustainable and supportable longer term. So what we did, a group of us got together and we created the first of the proper good RAD approaches, which is DSDM. And it was launched in the UK in 1994. And this was a group of organizations getting together and sharing their knowledge and their experience of their best practice RAD, what works and what didn't. So organizations like British Airways, British Telecom, British Rail, Oracle, Sysdeco, Co-op Bank, and a few others. And we just basically collaboratively shared what we were doing. We didn't worry about the commercial complexities or seeing one another as competitors. And looking at what everybody was doing, we distilled out of that the best practice. And we launched that in 1994, the first version, to say, look, here's an approach that we think works well in the corporate world. And it's continued to evolve ever since. So this was the first of the Agile approaches. And what's happened since then is there's been a lot more other RAD style approaches launched. Most of them came out of the US, and the majority of these are guru-led. So you'll have a name associated with them rather than a collaborative collegiate approach. So the next thing that happened was 2001, we recognized that RAD was not the best acronym. Because the first letter is R for rapid, the perception that people get is that speed is the major driver. And also a misconception that I've seen a lot is that, well, you're doing RAD, so you can give me everything I want in half the time it would physically take to deliver it, which is not particularly helpful. So what happened is representatives of all the various RAD approaches went away for a weekend. They were all gentlemen. There were no ladies there, unfortunately. And they went up to Snowbird in Utah, and we abandoned the word RAD and we swapped it for the word Agile, which is a much more meaningful word because it suggests flexibility, the ability to bend. A bit like Roadrunner, you get hit with a crowbar and your neck bends, but you keep running. And we also removed this link to software that was implied by the word rapid application, because Agile is not about software specifically. Agile is applicable to just about anything, but there's still a perception that Agile equals software, and it doesn't. So we positioned Agile as a style of thinking, not just an IT process. So at the heart of this, we have an Agile mindset, and then you bring together the people, the ability to change, personal and professional agility, and good quality thinking as well. So it's taking it much, much wider than the perception of software. So while they were in Utah, the guys came up with the Agile manifesto for, they call it software development. The guy that represented DSDM, Ari van Bennekom, and some others said very vehemently, it's not about software, it is about solutions. So usually most of us change the word software for solution, which makes it more meaningful. And the Agile Manifesto says that we're uncovering better ways of developing solutions by doing it and helping others do it. Through this work, we've come to value individuals and interactions above processes and tools. That doesn't mean the processes and tools are unimportant, but it means the processes and tools are there to support the individuals and their interactions with one another. We value working solutions above comprehensive documentation, but you still need enough documentation to support the solution in production. We value customer collaboration above contract negotiation. In other words, we collaborate with our customers first and only revert to the small print on the contract as a last resort, not a first resort. And finally, we respond to change above following a plan. But that doesn't mean you don't plan. So you will get people out there who are vehement exponents of Agile who will tell you, we don't use processes, we don't do documentation, we can't work under contracts, we don't do planning. They are basically wrong. That is not what the manifesto says, and that's not what it ever meant. It just meant the things on the left in green are what drive us, and the things on right in grey are what support those interactions in these elements. So this is still valid today, and it's what's behind Agile. But I always describe Agile as an umbrella term. So again, you'll hear people say Agile equals Scrum, which is one of the Agile approaches, or Scrum equals Agile. It's not, it's much, much bigger than that. So if you imagine Agile as an umbrella term encompassing a number of styles of approach, underneath there, on the left, you've got the light Agile approaches, things like Scrum, Kanban, Lean, extreme programming. On the right, we've got the more comprehensive, extensive Agile approaches, which are more focused on the complex corporate world. So Agile project management, Agile program management, Agile portfolio management, scaled Agile framework, DSTM. These are all the sort of corporate style more complex Agile approaches, but they all sit underneath this Agile thinking, this willingness to collaborate, cooperate, be flexible. So Agile is an empirical approach, and it's based around three absolutely fundamental concepts that drive us, and that's transparency, inspection, and adaptation. So first of all, the most important thing is we are transparent. Anybody should be able to see what's going on at any time very easily. So what we try and do with Agile is we make information available so people can pull it whenever they want to, rather than progress reports once a month. We do daily stand-ups, we do show and tells, and we try and create dashboards of current available information, typically in some areas no more than 24 hours out of date. So transparency is critical. But then the two other elements of this are the concepts of inspection and adaptation. So basically, as we're working, you check your work as you go. So you don't do a month, 2 months, 3 months, show it to somebody and get feedback. In an ideal world, you're getting feedback daily, hourly. In a perfect world, you sit next to the person you're doing the work for, and you're constantly giving their feedback. But also, very importantly, once you're getting the feedback and you're learning that what you've done is right, or what you've done it needs changing, you adapt. And again, in Agile, we recognize that it's okay to change tactical direction. And the wording on that is specific, not change strategic direction, but change the details. So if somebody tells me they want more of feature A, and they've agreed that they actually don't want feature B at all, we're perfectly happy to make those sort of changes within reason, within the bounds of what we've agreed we're trying to do. So just to give you some sort of details of what is the difference between a traditional linear style and an Agile iterative style. In a traditional style, we fix the features. So basically we create a functional spec and we promise, or we imply a promise to deliver all of it. In Agile, we fix time, cost, and quality rather than features. In a traditional style, we do big design up front. So having done all the analysis, we then do all the design. In an agile style, we do enough design up front, but we defer decisions until the last possible safe moment. In a traditional style, we work to big horizons. So the thinking, the planning is all long term, but surprisingly detailed, considering how much uncertainty is actually in there. In Agile, we work to horizons of all sizes. So yes, we do long-term planning, medium-term planning, short-term planning, immediate planning, everything from a year, long-term planning down to immediate planning. What am I going to do in the next 24 hours? In a traditional style, we complete work in phases. So we do analysis, design, build, test, user, acceptance test, deployment. In an agile style, we work story by story, requirement by requirement, and we build the solution and we build in feedback loops at every single step. So we're constantly checking that we're doing the right thing before it goes too wrong, and we can just tweak it, we can fix it. We do iterative development, we do incremental testing. So you test as you go rather than having a big test phase at the end. And even that alone reduces the risk of the end delivery a huge amount. In a traditional project, you're doing frequent feedback. So usually the feedback comes almost too late to do anything useful with it. In an agile approach, we do short feedback loops, potentially several times a day, at least once a week, once every 2 weeks. We do show and tells every 2 to 3 weeks, and we get feedback on those from our business community. And finally, key focus for Agile is, in a traditional approach, the individual skill sets typically work in isolation. They usually sit apart, think apart, and in one organization I worked in, they even had dinner separately. You didn't, if you were a tester, you didn't sit with the developers at lunch. It just wasn't done. In Agile, what we're looking for is collaborative working, multi-skilled groups. And we often talk in Agile about the need for T-shaped people. And a T-shaped person is somebody who has the in-depth skills in their own specific area, but they've also got the arms give them the feed and understanding to what other people are doing. So we don't have this sort of siloed working, but we want people to collaborate and work together as a team and appreciate the strengths and weaknesses and the skill sets shared amongst the team. So sort of the ability to communicate is also a key factor for working in Agile. So if you look at a traditional style of working, what we do in a traditional approach is we fix features. So there's an intrinsic promise that we're expecting to deliver 100% of the solution. That is almost like a promise. And when we hit problems, what happens typically is we move the deadline back. That's the first point of call in a traditional project. And you often hear business people saying the problem with IT, for example, is they always deliver late. And actually, it's quite difficult to run a business if you don't know when solutions are going to be delivered. And we often end up spending more money. So if we slip the deadline, then that will put the costs up because we need to keep the team on longer. Or sometimes people decide that we're running into problems, so you throw bodies at it. And that does not work. We know that doesn't work. The more people you put on the team, the more your existing teams slow down while you're explaining to the newcomers what they need to know so that they can start working. So we've seen this over many, many years. There are times when it works well, but there are some intrinsic problems with this style of approach, particularly in the modern world. So varying time and cost increases the costs regardless of what happens. And the other thing that happens when you run into these sort of issues is that actually you end up compromising quality. And that is because testing is one of the end phases in the life cycle. So if you're really running into problems with the deadline, the only thing you've got left to negotiate is the testing. So you compromise on the testing, you release something into production that is not as good as it should be, and you end up with solutions in production where this huge iceberg, underwater iceberg of costs, of lifetime support costs that we didn't take into account when we originally costed this piece of work. If you look at Agile by comparison, it's done slightly differently. So first of all, a primary objective for Agile is to deliver a solution on time, on cost. So we're always driven by cost, we fix team, and we're driven by time because we agree the deadline that we're working to. So when people say having fixed deadline is a risk, to me, actually it's a bonus. And those of you who were around with the year 2000, for example, saw that when you had an absolutely non-negotiable fixed deadline, people really focused their efforts on what's important. Quality is non-negotiable in Agile. So quality criteria are built in everywhere, right down to the individual stories. So if you've got a requirement, that requirement will have the acceptance criteria that tell you what needs to be in place for that requirement to be good enough, and then non-negotiable. And the contingency is built around the features. So basically, we hope to deliver 100% of the solution. It's the best possible solution, but it's unlikely given the level of uncertainty, the accuracy of estimating, and the sheer stuff happens scenarios. So what happens in Agile is when you hit a problem, you talk to the business owner of the solution, and they agree to drop the least important, the lowest values features to protect the on-time delivery. And in reality, that's exactly what happened in year 2000. Gosh, was it 20 years ago? So different to traditional, we fix time, fix cost, fix quality, and negotiate features. So the important thing here is if you're going to use Agile, it's about choosing the right approach. So I like analogies. So I've got two analogies for styles of working. And the first analogy, based on my several years at British Rail, a traditional approach to me is like a railway journey. Whether it's a steam train or it's a bullet train, you are constrained by limited choices. So you know where you're going from, you know where you're going to, and on a railway journey, you know pretty much where it's going to stop, on the assumption that the weather is kind and the overheads are still working and there isn't the wrong sort of leaf on the line. I can do the journey from Grantham to Leeds 20 times. I know where to get on, I know where to get off, I know how many stops, and I know how long it's going to take. And 9 times out of 10, it's a pretty predictable journey. And if there's a problem on the line, you can't just go off-piste. What actually happens is you end up sitting and waiting in the train until they clear the line and they can get you home. So that to me defines very much a traditional style of working, very predictable, constrained by technical constraints that mean going off-piste is not an option. By comparison, Agile is more like sailing, exciting sailing at that. So, it's not like pottering around on a small boat on a reservoir, but sailing is about getting from A to B, having a rough plan on how you're going to get there, and constantly never being quite where you expect to be, and constantly replanning to get back to where you need to be. So in Agile, if I was sailing from, where shall I pick? I'm going out of Ipswich Harbour and we're going down to Spain. I don't just set off and think, well, let's see where this is going to go. I've got a rough idea of what I'm going to do. I've got an overarching plan, and I set off on my first step to see how things are going. And it may be that I'm in a sailing vessel and I've had a few problems because the winds are stronger than I thought, the tide is stronger than I thought, but more worryingly, there's a very large ferry coming towards me, and although technically I've got right of way, he's not moving, so I shift. So then once I get to my first waypoint, I'm a bit off target, so I've got to replan from here to the end goal. So Agile is all about having a plan, but constantly readapting because of things that are happening around you. The logic behind this is if you think about trying to build something, you've got two things to deal with. You've got the requirements, the what, and you've got the solution, the how. And if you know exactly what the requirements are, and if you know exactly how you're going to build it, life is simple. And a linear style of approach works fine there. So if I've built something for you beginning of the year and you like what we've done and you'd like another one just slightly different, I can predict, because I've still got the same team, I can predict pretty well how that's going to work. But as soon as you move out from agreement and or certainty, your simple life becomes complicated. And what happens there quite often in a traditional world is analysts will sit down with the business and say, well, I'm sorry, it's no good. You have to tell me what you want. And it doesn't matter that you've never done it before. You've just got to describe what we need to do. So what they're trying to do is drag complicated back into simple, to make life simpler, to make it fit in with this linear, predictable approach. But once you get into complicated, Agile begins to come into its own. As you move further out into complex, you can only choose Agile. And most people working in a corporate world won't work with anarchy. But just to give you an example of anarchy, I used to work, a few years ago, I worked with a small company owned by an elderly entrepreneur who was in his 80s, a brilliant guy, mind of a teenager, 2 walking sticks and drove a Lamborghini. And as I say, mind of a teenager, and he stopped me in the canteen at lunchtime one day and said, Barbara, these mobile apps, they're good, aren't they? And I'm thinking, you're asking the wrong generation here. You know, I'm nearly as old as you are. I said, well, certainly my kids tell me they're great. He said, yeah, we should have one. So I said, okay, what would you like it to do? He said, I don't mind really, as long as it's got the brand on. How can you analyse that? That is anarchy. That's just a vague idea and go for it. So the reality is most people in a corporate world will be simple, complicated and complex. They won't be anarchy. But occasionally you might be doing design thinking where you're trying to explore really brand new ideas, and those ones are where all rules are off. But certainly the complicated and the complex world is where Agile is most at home and where the traditional world is most uncomfortable. So it's about trying to understand where are you in these choices to decide what sort of approach should you be taking. Because if you choose a traditional approach in the complex area, you're in for a very, very bumpy, very difficult ride. So what we have to accept, one of the Agile principles is you expect change and uncertainty. And change these days is the norm, not the exception in this modern VUCA world. So we talk a lot about volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous world. And it's been interesting that organizations and projects have to deal with this now because the real world is like this. And COVID has been unfortunately a very, very good example of a VUCA world. So any project manager that laminated their project plan in January, good luck with that, because all rules are off and everybody is trying to work out how to deal with this as they go along, because the amount of uncertainty, complexity and ambiguity in the modern world, and certainly in the current COVID world, is massive. So the important thing is that the speed of change is increasing exponentially. And for organizations to survive and thrive, they need to be flexible. They need to be agile. They need to be nimble, because if you don't, you will fail. There's so many businesses that go out of business very quickly, and it can be a big market-leading organization and they just miss, and suddenly they're gone. So Blockbusters, Kodak, BlackBerry. Nokia is one that for me is very sad, because I was doing a lot of work with Nokia. So it was working with the guys in Cambridge that worked on the operating systems, and then they became part of Nokia. Nokia were the best phones in the world. And I did a lot of work in Finland, and Finland, the whole economy and the education system is built around Nokia. And I remember sitting in a discussion with some technical guys from Nokia who were talking about phones. And one of the comments was, so what do you think to the iPhone then, this Apple phone? And one of the other technical guys said, it'll never catch on, because, I mean, it's useless at making phone calls. And I look back to that, and I look back to how quickly Nokia went from being market leader to virtually gone, just by missing that change, that pivot in the world. To realize that people aren't buying phones now because to making phone calls. If you look at, the teenagers now, they don't make phone calls. They text, they WhatsApp, they use all the modern, picture technology, but phone calls for a lot of the youngsters are a thing of the past, and some of them don't even do much talking. So we need to, organizations have got to see and adapt much faster than they used to have to. And if they don't, there is always the risk that you will fail. And this is a constant worry for large organizations. So one of my concerns is that there's a lot of misconceptions about Agile. So one is that the message that you're either Agile or you're not. Agile is binary. And if you are Agile, you've done really well, pat on the back. And if you haven't, if you're not Agile, you failed somehow and you should be trying harder. This is intrinsically wrong. This is simply not true. So I spend a lot of time explaining to people Agile is actually a spectrum. And you can be anywhere on the spectrum, from working in an extremely agile way or the other side, an extremely linear traditional way. None of this is wrong. It's just about making the right choices. Because if you have to be more traditional, because you've got a simple project and it's the best way of doing it, do it. It's the right thing to do. But if you're doing linear when you should be doing agile, then you're making the wrong choices. So anywhere on this spectrum is okay, provided it's a conscious choice rather than a default position. So everything depends on what type of business you're doing, this specific piece of work. So within your organization, you might have some work that is much more linear than others, some work that is always going to be more agile. So these are the sort of factors, amongst others, that will affect making the right choices. But in my experience, when I'm helping organizations define processes and quality procedures, in my experience, most corporate businesses sit somewhere in the middle. And this is what I would call the corporate sweet spot. And the reality is most corporate businesses do not work at the edge of extremely agile area, which is often described as edge of chaos. And they don't work at the extremely linear bureaucratic overload area. Most organizations sit in here. Certainly in all the ones I've worked with. We worked with a large aircraft manufacturing organization, and they were moving towards agile, and they said, we want to be agile, but we can't afford to go to edge of chaos because people will die. And we sort of defined their agile with the boundaries as with that green triangle. And we said, well, if you choose an agile approach that guides you, you won't fall into edge of chaos by mistake. So it's about making informed choices, but the majority of agile corporate organizations sit in this sort of quadrant here. And very few these days work at the extremes, which is a good thing. There's a misconception out there that if you're doing agile, governance is irrelevant. My answer to that one is always really. I was working with a rather fanatical agile team, and the auditors, because this was a formal quality approved organization doing CMMI level quality, and when the auditors went to speak to the agile guys, they actually said they were excused from governance because they were doing agile. So when I stopped laughing, I went and had a word with them and explained that they weren't excused. You still come under governance, you still come under quality procedures. It's just that the people that are governing you and auditing you have to be asking the right questions, because if you're working in an agile way, you ask different questions. So they're not polar opposites. The governance needs to be appropriate for what's being delivered. So, for example, it's no good asking me to show you my signed off functional specification, because Agile won't have one. It will have a living requirements grid that is constantly being updated, but it won't be signed off at the beginning. So Agile has worked very effectively in regulated organizations for many, many years. So one of my colleagues worked in pharmaceutical. I've worked a lot with financial insurance. I've worked with the military. I've worked in manufacturing. And the reality is you can't refuse governance or say that you've got a note from your mum that you're excused because you're doing Agile. That's simply just unrealistic. And it shows that some of the people doing Agile don't understand the corporate world. So Agile needs to work within the constraints within these types of organizations. So that means that their style of Agile will be limited in certain areas. It means that some things you're able to challenge, but some things you have to accept as non-negotiable. So for example, when it's, for example, safety critical, the quality, the level of testing, and that's testing that happens when you've technically finished, still has to be gone through because you have to meet the safety criteria. And we have to accept that. You can't say, oh, it's Agile. Trust me, it'll be fine. We've done the takeoff module. The landing module will be ready before you get there. We have to be realistic in that type of world. So it's recognizing that corporate Agile is a very different world to selling DVDs out of your garage, but it's still Agile. So there's a suggestion that Agile is only suitable for small, simple projects. Again, that's not true. So if you're working in complex corporates, you're going to need things like Agile project management, Agile program management, Agile portfolio management, Agile digital services. There is corporate strength guidance and successfully delivered in highly regulated environments. So I was advisor on a Ministry of Defence contract, which was doing the fly-by-wire on the Eurofighter between 3 defence suppliers who went into a collaboration, and I was advising on the estimates to put in for bidding for this work, and they bid Agile, they won the bid, and it was delivered very successfully. So we can do incredibly complex, highly regulated projects, but we can also do small, simple ones. I will apologise to our host, Kevin Foster, for this. There is also a perception out there that Agile is for youngsters, only for youngsters. I've been told that I can't possibly be doing Agile because I'm not cutting code. And this is told to me by somebody who's at least 15, who's a very good developer, but doesn't understand the corporate world. Just for fun, my nickname a few years ago when I was managing British Rail was, my official title was Rad Manager. My unofficial title was Rad Mum because I had a lot of the graduate entrants. And these days I've been around a lot longer, and unfortunately I've been given the nickname of Agile Granny, but that's absolutely fine. So Agile is for everyone. It's not just for Kevin. And the point about Agile is it's good for anyone. It's about common sense. I'm not supposed to say this. Agile is mostly just common sense. But unfortunately, common sense isn't that common. But agility is a very, very natural human behavior. We adapt to survive. We use adaptability. We use agility in our day-to-day life. It's just about bringing that common sense into the working environment. I've met 100-year-olds that are still very agile, although this may be mental agility rather than physical. But I've also met millenniums, agile fanatics that are so dogmatic, they're awful. I've been told, it says in the book, you can't do that. And I have great fun. Sometimes I point out that my name is actually at the front of the book and I was part of writing the book. But a lot of people think that Agile is about dogmatically applying what Agile says rather than being agile. So Agile has always got to be flexible and adapt to the situation you face. Also, take a lot of this Agile bragging with a pinch of salt. So you'll hear a lot of organizations sort of announce publicly, we are now Agile. I love this cartoon because the reality is a bit more like that. When you look at it, you might find that when they say they're doing really well in Agile, they've got one small Agile thingy at the bottom of a huge complex load of projects under development. The reality is if you're transforming to become an Agile organization, this is a huge major change program, not a binary cutover. It doesn't happen overnight. Oh. Sorry, can you still see that? I lost my slide, my mistake. So the message for Agile is getting out there. I've been a lone nut sort of promoting Agile for a long time now. If anybody's not seen the Lone Nut TED Talk, it's great fun. But what we're finding now is Agile is finally accepted and it is becoming a buzzword. There are lots of books with Agile in the title, lots and lots and lots of books. So, getting results the Agile way, Agile contracts, Agile HR, Agile testing, emotional agility. There are so many things out there about Agile, but there are also misguided opinions. So you see Agile is seen as the solution to all problems. Those are the Agile fanatics, but also people who suggest that Agile is a necessary evil. And these are the traditional thinkers. But to me, it's about finding out about what it is, getting the knowledge so that you can make the informed choices about when to use it and when not to use it. And there are projects that I with all my 25, 30 years of experience of doing Agile, I would not choose to do Agile properly, but I would use some of the Agile techniques to improve the communication and the collaboration. So if you look at Agile, Agile is a collection of things. It's not software, it's people-based. It's a mindset, it's based around common sense. It gets results through teamwork and collaboration, and that's how it speeds things up, but it still applies the law of physics. If it's a year's worth of work, it will take a year to do it, potentially. Agile is all about being Agile. It's not just about doing Agile. And if you are Agile, Agile thinking sits at the heart of everything you do, but it's so much more than a buzzword. So I think that's me done. So what I'd like to do is stop sharing my screen, if I can see how to do it, and hand back to Kevin. Not the Kevin in the picture, you'll see.
Thank you very much, Barbara. I had to chuckle at your slide there about the Kevin. I can assure you I've worked for most of my career in an Agile world, so I do resonate with what you're saying.
Yeah, most people have, they just often don't know it.
That was a great presentation, Barbara. Thank you very much. I can see we've got about 21 questions. I think we should move straight into Q&A. I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Ian Buxton, who will manage the Q&A session.
Thank you, Kevin. Yes, as Kevin said, we've got 21 questions. Just before and they're good questions, some of them, and as you can imagine, Agile does create quite a lot of fairly firm views one way or the other. And just before I move on to the first one, Barbara, there's just one that came in about CPDs for this particular lecture. Yes, we can provide CPDs, but that requires an email to go to Julie Hudson of the IET. So if you drop an email to julie.hudson@ietvolunteer.org, she'll get the CPD certificate organized. So with that, straight on to the questions. Now, the first one is, I think, quite an interesting one because it's coming from Ken McNaught, talking about that first slide, one of those early slides about Royce page 1 and Royce page 2. So he's asked the question, how does the traditional waterfall differ from the page 2 iterative type picture? So how different is that to the Agile that you were talking about?
Well, the interesting thing is it's not so very different, but the frustrating thing is anybody that talks about waterfall in the Royce style only ever read page 1. So that's what people have in their mind. So the reality is if you are working in a very constrained, more linear style, if you follow the Royce page 2, that to me is a linear style, but with the iterations, with the feedback loops built in. It's when people follow Royce page 1 as, dogmatic, that's the way a linear style has to be, that's where the problems come. And as I say, it's unfortunate that, as is often true, you give people a paper to read. It's a bit like if it's not on page 1 of the management summary, then it probably won't ever get read at all. Thank
you, Barbara. Let's move on. A question from Salim, which is close to my heart, having spent 30 years in service support. He asks, what point does in-service support and disposal termination planned, when does that start to get talked about in Agile?
Right, well, if you're doing Agile properly in a corporate world, then, for example, I would have representatives of the in-service support team as stakeholders to my project, to the point where I normally engage them I give them the opportunity to be part of the testing, because that actually gives you a much easier handover into in-service support. When you actually move into support, typically people will use often a Scrum, a Kanban style of Agile style to support the most important things. So that, you know, you have to be very flexible. You don't just work through list support issues in a linear style, you prioritize them. So if something's a critical error, it will go straight to the top of the pile. And that is sort of underpins a lot of the Agile thinking, that you prioritize so you are flexible about the way you work. And disposal and termination, I mean, this is part of the product life cycle. And again, it's in the early stages, you might not think too much about it, but we're certainly if you're working in a corporate world, you always ask about what is the life expectancy of this piece of work, and you plan in the quality accordingly. So if it's a short-term tactical solution, then you agree that it's going to be in for 3 months. The only thing you have to do then is make sure that at the end of 3 months, people do pull the plug and don't keep it in production for 2, 3, 4, 5 years when it was never designed for longevity.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Next question from Patricia. I think you may have answered this in your presentation, but worth perhaps just repeating some of it, Barbara. She asks, what is the difference between delivering on quality and delivering on features?
Okay, so the example I often use is if I win the lottery and I decided to buy a Rolls-Royce car, I would choose to have a Rolls-Royce car, but I wouldn't have a sat-nav because I absolutely love my TomTom. But it would still be a Rolls-Royce car, even though it's got a feature missing. But if I bought a Rolls-Royce car with sat-nav, but the seat was plastic, rather than the nice sort of hand-tooled leather, I'd have all the features, but I wouldn't have the quality. So it's getting people to understand that features and quality are two different things. They're not always naturally associated. You can have a subset of features where everyone meets the quality that is needed for it, and you've got all the features that give you a production quality workable solution, but you might not have some of the lower level features. So for example, I might be able to pay by debit card, PayPal and credit cards, but I might have decided, because we've had problems, that we drop payment by American Express, but I still have the ability to pay. People sometimes confuse the two, and quality and features are two different things. They are not, you know, all or nothing. So you can drop features but still deliver a quality solution.
Yes, thank you. The next question, I think, is most of us have come across in our careers, and it's from David. He asks, how do you get your customer to accept that they may not get all the features that they asked for at the outset?
I have a good way of doing this. So I sit down with my customers and I say, okay, right, so you've got 4 things. You've got 4 knobs you can tune. You've got time, cost, quality, features, and you have to negotiate at least on one of them. Okay, that's before we start. Then we get the requirements and we size them. So we know roughly how long they're going to take. And I say, okay, well, if those are your requirements, where are you going to negotiate? You can't fix all of them. So do we negotiate time, cost, features? And if they say, no, we need all of them, I'll say, well, that's fine. So what's going to happen, just to explain, is we will end up negotiating quality, because that will happen by default. Please, I'm sending you an email. Please, can you approve officially that we're going to compromise quality? Because we have to explain to people that if you have more work than can physically fit, we have to compromise somewhere. And with the best will in the world, I would love to give you everything you want. But if you want it by that deadline, it cannot be done unless you've got unlimited time and unlimited resources, and we don't. So I make the customer choose. And if they want 100% features, then I need to know that we can slip deadline or bring bodies on it. And then I need to explain, where are we going to get the bodies from? So yes. I start with that discussion on the 4 things that you can negotiate, and I need to agree that there is going to be at least one.
Barbara, there's a very related question from Walter, who asks a similar question, but goes on to say, do you have advice for working with customers or companies in industries which are very traditionally waterfall, such as automotive, military, energy, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the energy companies are working agile already. Automotive, I've worked with a number of automotive companies that are working agile, and the military are incredibly agile. I mean, if you talk to the military guys, I mean, with the exception of some of the people that work with the military, but the military guys themselves, they freely admit that they have rules, they have ways of working, but they said when you're on the front line in a war situation, you are empowered to make the decisions that you have to make at the time because you're the only one that can do that. So they devolve empowerment to the front line. And this is about, to me, I talk to organizations and say, well, does everything you do work beautifully now? Because obviously if it does, then why would you change? But on the assumption that some of the areas it's not working, there are other ways that you could think about. So I'm not pushing Agile just for pushing Agile's sake, but it's saying to people, we're doing this because presumably your current way of working has a few problems with it. So it's getting people to understand this is an evolution, not a revolution. It's what you've got that works, but add an extra facility, an improvement to the way you work, so you've got more choices.
Okay, thank you, Barbara. This next question is a slightly different take on it. It's from Cormac. He's saying, with the increasing uptake of circular economy models, including remanufacturing, Agile is showing its value in managing manufacture in a constantly changing environment. What are your thoughts on how Agile principles can be applied in remanufacture?
I'm not entirely sure what remanufacture means.
I think it's where I'm guessing as well here a little bit, so I hope I'm not.
Is this recycling?
Yes, I think it's the circular economy means that you're basically taking a whole life, through from design through to disposal and reuse. So I guess it's kind of related to reusing and remanufacturing from materials or solutions that have been used before.
Well, I mean, reuse of software has been around for a long time and it needs to be done better than it has been in the past. But I mean, reuse, if you think about sort of uncertainty, we might be building something now and we think we know how we're going to reuse it in the future. But by the time we come to that point, actually, there's going to be different options around anyway. So I think it's just keeping an open mind and just not pinning anything down sooner than you need to. You've got ideas, but you don't itemize the ideas until later on in the cycle, because you don't need to create that future certainty now. You just need to have a stage plan for what's going to come in the future.
Yes, if we haven't answered that one particularly correctly, Cormac, we do apologize. So perhaps we'll have to deal with that offline. Let's move on anyway. A question from Oscar here, which I think you've touched on, Barbara, but he's asking, how does Agile focus on cost, time and quality with uncertainty? Does it mean more budget?
No, quite the opposite. What we do with Agile is for example, we don't go into the low-level detail very early on. But if you've got people that know their job and they've been around for a while, for example, if I know that I've got to capture customer details, I don't need to go down to all the detailed level and work out exactly what I'm going to capture, because I know roughly that to capture customer details is a medium piece of work. But we leave the detail of that till later. But the way we deal with uncertainty is we estimate in the early stages to a 50 to 100% sort of contingency in the estimating, and we narrow it down and we narrow it down. We prioritize, we build contingency by prioritization. So if we're using something like Moscow, must have, should have, could have, won't have this time, what we try and do is build no more than 60% must have work and build in 40% should haves and could haves. So that's actually more than the standard 10% contingency anyway. So if we run into problems, the way we deal with it is we don't ask for more money. we say we drop features, but we still deliver a production quality, viable, sort of good quality solution. It might just have some features missing.
Yeah. The next question is anonymous actually, but must be a software architect, because the question is, where does the software architect fit into a large scale? I guess he means large scale agile project.
Yeah, so this is where you need to look at the things like agile project management rather than Scrum, because Scrum is a very, very simplistic team-based approach. If you look at something like agile projects management, we have team level roles, but then we have the project level roles. And at that level, you would have what we call a technical coordinator, but is a bit like a software architect. So this is the been there, done it, got the t-shirt, understands how everything fits together. And this is the person that technically will point out the holes before you fall into them. If you're working within an agile program, then you've got the senior sort of technical architects who are doing the strategic technical design for a large organization. And this is where it's important that agile isn't working in isolation in a pocket somewhere doing their own stuff, because in a large corporate, you can't just make it up as you go along. You have to fit in with other things.
Yep. The next two questions are kind of related, because they're talking about the people aspect. So Peter asks, where would you say are the overlaps and differences between agile and systems engineering in terms of approaches and personal individual characteristics?
Okay, so the first thing that I look at when I'm employing and recruiting, I look for people that have got the sort of the T-shape. So I want people that are really good at their job. But I always look for people that are able and willing to communicate, because, for example, communication is very, very difficult to teach to somebody that doesn't want to do it. And anybody that's worked with teenagers or lives with teenagers will understand what that's like. It's that sort of 3 or 4 year period where if a teenager doesn't want to talk, they just don't. I can't be doing that in a team, in an agile team, because I want people that will talk to others, will share information, that are not constantly on the defensive. So it doesn't mean you can't be a brilliant software engineer, but I don't want people that would prefer to work alone in a cupboard. And unfortunately, some of the older people that worked at British Rail when I was the lunatic trying to talk about Agile, they didn't like team working. They wanted to have a specification and do a really, really good job and take as long as it takes. So I look for the softer skills as well as people being good at their job. And I'm not saying that you're not employable if you are a silo thinker. It's just that the type of work for that type of personality will actually over time become less. But it's recognizing that if somebody is technically really brilliant, but they're not a communicator for whatever reason, then we find them work that fits with them.
So that does nicely lead on to the next question, because George asks, is there not a people quality and scale limitation? T-shaped people are rare, and when you add in the need for creativity associated with development teams, they become even rarer. So I guess you've answered that partly, but I would ask the question, I think, related to that, is that something that you can train into people, do you think, Barbara?
I think it's easier to train the T-shape into people, because what I do when I'm team building is I use techniques to make everybody aware of what everybody else is good at. So that's a good starting point, instead of thinking my skill is the important one and I'm not interested in you guys. So I'll get developers and testers to work as a pair, for example, so they feed off one another and they learn about one another's role. I think you can build T-shaped people, but when you say they're rare, I don't agree. I mean, I coach, I employ, I work long-term in large organizations. And if you look at the modern education system compared to when I went to uni, if you did sort of software, it was more about maths and, binary and, science. Now, even if you're studying that type of area, you also look at business skills and communication skills as well. but it's recognizing that for some people that is just a step too far. But there are lots of people out there that have the ability to do this.
Yeah. The next question is more of a statement, but let's get round to it. Nokia has not failed, Ben says. It's about to ride the rescue of the 5G rollout. Yeah, I wonder. But it failed to do what it failed to do was to sell a vision to the public customer. Has it perhaps survived because it did not respond too quickly to consumer whims?
It's possible. I can't say. And if they, I would love to think they hadn't failed. I mean, it would be interesting to look at Finland and see how it's working in Finland, because that's to me is the litmus paper of Nokia, succeeding, because all the universities are built around Nokia centres, or were. Yeah. I still think Nokia phones are brilliant, and you may be right that it's not reacting to every single blip in the market, but you must admit that Nokia's had a very, very rocky few years, and it's caused a lot of distress in places, and particularly in places like Finland, which I think is very sad, because they are undoubtedly brilliant phones, brilliant software, and the people I work with were brilliant.
Okay, the next couple are quite short, I hope. What is your definition of done? When is something complete?
Well, I mean, Agile talks a lot about a definition of done, and a definition of done could be that you list the criteria that because we don't like half done. It's a bit like lean. We don't want lots of stuff in flow. We like stuff that's either done or not done, and you measure progress on what is done. So, for example, for a requirement to be done, you must have written test criteria to prove the acceptance criteria have been met, and it meets the corporate standards, and that would include things like the appropriate level of documentation. Definition of done at a higher level would be, for example, that the release is done, it's deployable if it's tested to the appropriate level of quality, and it includes at least the must-have requirements, because that's my minimum usable subset. If we've got must-have requirements missing, then it's not done and it can't go live. So we always understand what done, what quality is, and everybody needs to know what that is.
Yeah. The next one is from Ian, DA. Isn't Agile just another branding of quality risk management?
I don't think so, because quality and risk management, in my experience, is quite often being beaten up by people with questionnaires and no brain switched on a bad day. Asking me questions, not listening. I mean, Agile, if it's done properly, is incredibly disciplined, incredibly professional. And it is about managing risks. But what happens in risk management is people don't manage the risk of uncertainty. Or the way they manage it in a traditional world is they try and drag people back to simple by making them define something they don't know, that they haven't seen, and expecting that definition to be accurate and then holding them to it. So I think that it's a bit simple to suggest that. I think quality is in Agile, risk management is in Agile, but Agile, above all, is just being flexible, having a flexible mindset. It's not against quality, and it definitely does its own risk management because it's managing the risk of uncertainty, but it's not just anything. You've got to get your mind in the Agile way of thinking as well. So they fit together, but it's not the same thing, because there's a perception when you start waving quality or risk management that it's a process that you follow and you tick things, and you don't necessarily, it's certainly in some organizations, if you follow the tick list, you're not encouraged to think. In Agile, you're encouraged to think all the time.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Barbara. The next question, I'm not sure I totally understand it, but can you comment on how solutions providers calculate the price of their projects in a limited requirements environment? I would say it's probably a bit easier, isn't it?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about doing Agile in a commercial contract environment, you can do Agile contracts. The interesting thing, the way contracts work currently, is that as a supplier, when you're bidding, you build in contingency into your numbers, and you hope, you bid higher because you need to build something in, or else you bid low on the expectation that the specification is actually not very good, but you're going to charge a lot for changes. But you can do agile contracts. They do exist. The best sort of contract for both sides, actually, if it's done properly, is time and materials. But the perception with customers is the fixed price is more secure. But actually, you can be stitched up really badly with a fixed price contract. But the best working environment is a collaborative, cooperative environment where both parties are trying to do the best for one another.
And that probably leads on to his next question, which says, do you have any metrics when agile approaches have led to disappointed customers who then resort to the contractual small print?
They will happen. They will always happen. I mean, we bid for a project when I was at British Rail, and we won it, and the customer had asked for agile. So we bid agile and they accepted agile, and we talked to them about Moscow, and they nodded and smiled and made all the right noises. And then we hit a problem, and I went to the customer and said, okay, so we're doing agile as you agreed. So which requirement shall we drop? And my customer said, oh, I didn't want that bit. I wanted the fast and I wanted it on budget, but I didn't want to drop requirements. And I said, but you've signed up to that. And they said, well, I'm very unhappy with this. So it is difficult because it's trying to make people understand that there are implications to this. You can't have time, cost, quality and features. And I thought it had been explained absolutely explicitly, but clearly we had selective listening at that point from the customer. So you will get unhappiness, but my experience is once people have started doing agile, the majority never want to go back to the old way of working. Selling agile these days, once people understand what it is and what's in it for them, it's a lot easier to sell than it was in the early 90s.
Yeah. Let's move on. There's a question here from George. When implementing individual stories one at a time, there needs to be an environment into which it can be implemented subsequently and subsequently orchestrated. What level of infrastructure or platform capability is beneficial?
Okay, so if you're doing requirements one at a time, they are always within a higher level hierarchy. So when you're down to the low level, you still know what the hierarchy is. So give you an example, I was working for an insurance company, and at the highest level, we understood that this piece of work would do renewals, new customers, midterm adjustments, and other stuff in 4 releases, and we knew the reason why. So when we were working on renewals, we gradually break down and down to the lowest level of detail. The way that was managed, you can use Excel, you can use Rationale, there's all sorts of tools that you can use to manage requirements. In terms of structure, infrastructure, it just depends on what organization you're working in. You don't need a different infrastructure because you're doing agile. You just need the people that are managing releases, for example, to work with you so that you understand their constraints and they understand yours. So when I was working in a large complex financial organization, although we were doing fully agile, although we were testing as we went, we had to work with their constraints that before you ever went live, there was still going to be a 12-week full-on test it to destruction because it was a financial product. And that wasn't particularly agile, but our joy was we said to them, okay, go, off you go, but you won't find any functional errors. That was the criteria we set for ourselves, and they didn't. They might have found integration issues in the production environment, but sometimes you're doing a release and you have to fit in with other people as well. And that's typical of the corporate world and the constraints you have to work for.
Thanks, Barbara. It's coming up to 8:14 now, so I think we'll just limit it to 2 last questions, and then we'll have to take the others offline in some way. But this first question, I think, is right up your street. From David, what are the good agile resources we should use to learn more?
Look at the people stuff. I mean, have a look at the Agile Business Consortium. There's lots of interesting stuff there on things like culture and leadership. Agile project management came out of there originally. Have a look at the Agile project management, Agile program management. I know you've got Rod as part of your community, and Rod's done some amazing stuff on Agile leadership. So do follow up with him. He's part of your IET community. I've done a lot of work with Rod, and he's sort of doing groundbreaking stuff on the Agile people and the agile thinking things. Just be a little bit wary of some of the American guru-led Scrum is the answer to the question of the universe, because unfortunately when people take the wrong agile approach and try and do something very simplistic in a large complex corporate, when they're told by people who are agile fanatics that there's no role in project manager in agile, which is completely wrong. So we myself and 2 colleagues published a white paper on agile project management is not a contradiction. Somebody said about software architects, again, of course you have software architects if you're working in a large complex corporate. Why wouldn't you? So I think don't take the sort of simplistic team level view, that's part of it, but also look at the bigger view of agile in the sort of area of complex corporate, rather than just 2 or 3 people doing like let's sell some DVDs. Complex corporate world is different, and it's going to be wider thinking, more constrained. It's going to have more roles in it because you've got a lot more collaboration at different levels. So you've got team, project, program, portfolio, senior management, governance, audit. They all have to come together and all need to understand. They've all got to be brought together so everybody knows how they fit.
Excellent, thanks. And the last question, I think, is a great question from Kathy. You might like to answer it. Is it too late to apply an agile mindset to the Brexit negotiations?
Well, I believe there must somewhere be in both sides' head a Moscow prioritization, and it's the dreaded red line. But certainly, sort of last gasp is quite difficult, because I get called into projects when they're failing. And my most amusing experience was being brought into a project. Basically, this project has been going for 18 months. It was due a year ago, and it's already, it's still running, and it's about 2 years behind. Barbara, we'd like you to come in and fix it. Could you go agile? And we need it live in 3 months. And it was a bit like the Monty Python's Dead Parrot sketch. I was trying to explain that their project had died a long time ago. And although I was good, I can't, resuscitate a dead parrot. And what they should have done was stopped it. And, I'm not sure about Brexit. I'm just keeping my head down. It's caused so much grief. I don't know. But it is interesting with COVID. I have seen people with COVID asking questions that are looking for absolute certainty. Certainty makes them feel comfortable. And one of the questions a while ago was, can you tell me the date and the time that the R number went below 1? Yeah. And you're thinking, why are you looking for, how does that help? As if people know, as if, suddenly it ticks over. But people still look for certainty in an uncertain world. Whereas if you're agile, you just say, there's stuff I know, and there's stuff I don't know yet, but all will become clear as we get closer. And I'm sure the same is true of Brexit. And that's all I'm saying about Brexit.
Okay, so I think we'll have to leave it there in terms of questions, Barbara. There's quite a few more, and hopefully we can perhaps find a way of answering them offline. But I think with that, we just need to hand back to Kevin now, who can say a few words to close the presentation.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Barbara. That's a fantastic presentation. Thank you very much. And the questions have really illuminated the area, and I think it must be a must-watch, one of the webinars for the IET folks. So thank you so much for the work that you've put in to present.
Thank you for inviting me.
And my thanks to Ian for grouping the questions and asking the questions on behalf of the audience. I know there are 1 or 2 questions that are still left, but you got through a huge amount of the questions. So thank you so much. I'm just going to try and share my screen here. Just bear with me a second. Folks, I'd like to remind you that the recording of the webinar will be made available on our IET community's website as soon as possible. Now, you've got the link here, which is displayed on the screen. And as Barbara said, Rod is going to weave his magic on the recording, and we'll try and get the recording up just as soon as possible. So there have been 1 or 2 questions on, when will the recording be available and where will it be available? There's the link, and we will make the recording becoming available just as soon as Rod can work his magic on it. So next, I would like to draw your attention to our first webinar of 2021, which will be entitled Nobody Saw It Coming, the Rise and Rise of the Camera Phone. And that's quite topical, as we've been talking about Nokia and iPhones and everything. That's going to be on the 26th of January 2021. So if you'd like to register for that, again, the same link just below on the screen there. That's our IET Communities homepage. So please check that website for further details and how to register. And there will be a program of further webinars during 2021. So finally, on behalf of the IET Anglian Coastal Local Network, thank you all for joining tonight, and thank you to the team who put on tonight's webinar. And once again, Barbara, thank you so much for a great presentation and the hard work that you've put into the area and to make it so very, very interesting and relevant. So with that, I would like to wish everyone a happy Christmas and a prosperous new year. And that concludes the webinar for tonight. You may disconnect.